Okay, Chapter 9 talks about victims. So let's start with an overview of some research on sexual victimization. Before the 1970s, we didn't really know very much of this, but during the 70s, we have, as part of the feminist movement, the victims' right movement. And this consists of three main things. One is that they wanted to guarantee victims' participation in criminal proceedings. They also wanted to secure financial benefits and services for victims of crime, and to be able to secure more certain and harsher punishment for perpetrators. And as a result of this, we see the field of victimology develop as well. Victimology is similar to criminology, except that it's looking at things from the perspective of being a victim. So it's typologies of victims. It talks about things like victim precipitation and structural elements of victimization as well. In the 19th century, it was dismissed the notion that victimization was common. Freud claimed his patients' reports of abuse were a result of fantasy and unresolved Oedipal complexes. He also believed that women were predisposed to bringing false accusations against men of good character. And this victim blaming continues through the 1930s, with some even arguing that the child might actually be the seducer. In the 1960s, research on sexual victimization, especially children, began to increase. And we see two federally funded studies, and these studies reveal to us that child abuse is actually pretty common. Most of the time, the perpetrators were adults who knew the children, and that the long-term damage could be devastating. By the 70s, sexual assault becomes a purview of child protection professionals and becomes a major focus of the feminist movement. Here we start to talk more about how abuse is the fault of the perpetrator, not the victim, and that a lot of times it's the result of women's inferior place in society. And this is also the period of time where we start to see more empirical research being done. So one of the things that we discovered was abuse within the family and abuse by people in positions of authority was a lot more common than originally thought. And that this isn't really contained to certain social, economic, or ethnic boundaries. By the 80s, we start to discuss a lot more about psychological trauma, and in 1980, PTSD is added to the DSM. And then by the 90s, court proceedings are becoming more victim-focused. So how does victimization affect people? First of all, there's physical harms. Most victims who are sexually assaulted do not face an armed offender. Only about 6% are threatened with a weapon. According to the NCVS, about a quarter of all rape victims between 92 and 98 were physically injured, and this included things like bruises, black eyes, or cuts. They might often experience two medically unexplained symptoms, which is referred to as somatization. And this is basically believed that what happens is sometimes when we're going through emotional pain, that this manifests itself through physical pain. This could be back pain, pelvic pain, or headaches. Other potential harms including pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. And of course, these, in addition to the physical ailments that they cause, can produce psychological harm as well. Sexually transmitted infections occur in up to 30% of rape cases, and HIV in about 0.2% of cases. Just under 5% of cases result in pregnancy. Psychologically speaking, people who are victimized as youth show higher levels of mental health problems as adults. They tend to experience more fear, anxiety, and depression. They tend to have more emotional deprivation and anxiety-related disorders, eating disorders and problems with sleep, low self-esteem, and a lot of self-blame. And they may find themselves withdrawing from interacting with other people in social settings. The most common reaction, though, is fear and anxiety. At the time of the assault, the victim may be fearing for their life, which can lead to nerves and specific anxiety about future sexual assaults. Depression is common, accompanied with crying spells, fatigues, feelings of guilt, hopelessness, and suicidal thoughts. Withdrawal then can, of course, further perpetuate that cycle. Child sexual abuse often develops later in adulthood once the harmful nature of the behavior is understood. So Finkelhor from UNH notes that developmental factors may impact reactions to the abuse. So basically, what kind of coping strategies, what kind of support system does the person have? What kind of environmental buffers are available to them? Some studies do show a link between victimization and future delinquency. But again, most people who are victims do not go on to engage in criminal behavior. This can also then affect someone's sexual trajectory and how they function as a sexual adult or sexual teen. Images of sexual abuse may become incorporated into early masturbation, and they could become tied to deviant interests through classical conditioning. For men, a lot of times this can lead to confusion and anxiety about their sexual identity as well. Girls are more likely than boys to have been sexually abused during childhood, and they're more likely to disclose. So first of all, victimization is underreported to begin with, but certainly male victimization is acutely underreported. And the lack of knowledge about sexual assault for male victims is pretty striking. Women tend to internalize, whereas men tend to externalize. So women tend to physically harm themselves or have psychological and emotional problems, whereas men tend to reassert their masculinity, have reflexive reactions to physical pain. And they may also experience a lot of self-blame. It's not uncommon when someone is sexually assaulted for the body to physically respond to that. And so if someone has experienced, has physically responded to that, and in particular for men, if they did experience an erection and they did ejaculate, they may feel a lot of self-blame, and this may cause them to really question whether or not something was an assault and question their sexual identity as well. So let's talk a little bit about rape trauma syndrome. So this is a stress response, and it's a stress response by the victim following forced or non-consenting sexual activities. And so this has been identified several different phases by different researchers. One is an acute phase, right? So we experience trauma, and there's usually an acute phase that happens right afterwards. It's a short, and it's what's happening in the immediate aftermath of being a victim of a trauma. And then there's a reorganization phase where we come to accept and cope with this. So people who have researched this talk about experiencing denial, anger, grief, depression, taking action, and then acceptance. Kotz and Harvey have another sort of pattern that they look at. They talk about anticipatory, what's the behavior before and during the assault, what's the behavior immediately after and that impact, how do we adjust, and then of course, how do we accept and cope. Holmes and Holmes talk about shock, denial, and integration as well. So other things to think about are people that are close to the survivor. And we often use the word survivor when we talk about victims of sexual assault. So we're talking about secondary victims here. What about parents? What about significant others? These are folks that may need counseling themselves. In cases of child sexual abuse, the parent's role is very important, and they may have a lot of feelings of guilt. They may feel like they were negligent and responsible. So Johnson put together a model of mothers of incest survivors. One includes one of these categories or typologies are collusive mothers. They know the abuse is occurring and they ignore it. Others are powerless. They may want to help but can't because they are weak or maybe a victim themselves. And then there are protective mothers who help and intervene as soon as they become aware of the abuse. In cases of interfamilial abuse, so abuse that's going on in the family itself goes through a lot of changes. The victim may be removed from the home from their own protection, or the offender may be removed. The family may blame the victim. Survivors, however, report that the most positive and supportive attitudes towards them come from their female peers. So what can we do when we're responding to this? If someone reports a sexual assault to us, what does medical process and what's the criminal justice process look like? Well, first of all, the hospital has several duties to you. One is an exam, treatment, and post-exam. And so in Massachusetts, you can go to any emergency room in order to be seen for either just to be seen for treatment or to have a rape kit processed as well. There are hospitals that are designated SANE sites, and SANE stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. Those sites in the greater Boston area, there's 7 of them. They're all the major trauma centers, so Mass General, Children's, BW, BI, Newton Wellesley, and I'm definitely forgetting one. What they will do is they will call a specially trained nurse, a SANE nurse, who is specially trained in collecting evidence. And what they will do is they will explain to you what your options are for this. In Massachusetts, you're not required to undergo a sexual assault kit, and you can also have a sexual assault kit performed and not have to report to the police. So you can have evidence collected and then take some time when your head is a little bit clearer to determine whether or not you would actually want to prosecute or report the assault to the police. The hospital can also provide treatment for you, so they can provide a range of antibiotics to treat any potential sexually transmitted infections. They can provide you with Plan B, and they can basically just examine you and to make sure that that your health is okay and that there's nothing else kind of going on. The police have a couple of duties. One is to interview the victim, to investigate the crime, and to collect evidence. Oftentimes, there are no witnesses to sexual assaults, and we want to make sure that police have been specially trained in interviewing victims. There's a lot of research that tells us that the manner in which the police interview a victim really impacts how much the victim will disclose, and then that impacts in turn the ability to prosecute the offender. In Massachusetts, excuse me, our police are pretty well trained. In the greater Boston area, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center provides a great deal of training for police, and they're pretty amazing. The majority of cases involving children are handled through social services and family courts, and a lot of times they're interviewed in what's called a child advocacy center. CIC is a specially set up room that allows the child victim to be interviewed by one person. So basically, a forensically trained interviewer would interview the child victim, and in another room through an earpiece, all the other parties that may need to interview the victim, social services, the police, whoever else may need to interview them, are able to sort of feed questions to that person so that the child only has to be interviewed once. Child witnesses, however, present special problems, and we can interview them in a variety of ways. So we can use dolls where we ask them to talk about what happened to them. We can ask leading questions. We can videotape them. But some things we have to think about is how mature the child is and how competent they are. We have to make sure we use vocabulary that's appropriate for their age. And as I mentioned, the way the police respond to victims is crucial. So at any point in the process, you want to remember that the criminal justice system is an adversarial process. At any point, a case can be dropped. And just because you have decided to report to the police doesn't mean that the police are going to take your case anywhere. So first, if someone has been arrested, we're going to have an initial appearance. And they're going to decide whether or not they're going to release somebody prior to trial. They may be released on bail or released on their own recognizance. And that decision is going to be made based on the nature of the crime, the safety posed by their release, and the best interest of the accused. Most sex offenders are employed, have strong community ties, and have little likelihood of flight. Formal charges may then be filed, and someone may then be arraigned. The arraignment is the point at which a plea is going to be entered. They may also choose to plead guilty at this point. Whether or not a prosecutor decides to move forward is based on what kind of evidence they have and how credible the victim is. And the duty here of the district attorney is to secure a conviction. In order to do so, they have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. We have really low conviction rates with sexual assault cases, mostly due to lack of witnesses and forensic evidence. The defense has been pretty clever, and it's very difficult to prove coercion. There's many benefits to pleading out, and there's benefits for both the defense and for the victim in these cases. One thing is it can save the court some time and expense and work of proving guilt at a trial while also assuring a conviction. The defendant benefits by getting a lesser sentence, and this also reduces overcrowding. For the victim, this means they don't have to testify at trial, and they can ensure a conviction. There's four main issues, though, when we use a child as a witness in court. First of all, for children, sometimes it's difficult to understand the difference between truth and fantasy. And so a judge is really going to need to spend some time to make sure that a child is a competent witness. We also want to make sure they have the mental capacity to understand what actually took place and the memory to recall specifics correctly. And then finally, they have to be able to communicate that clearly in court. So in the past, a defense attorney was able to bring up a survivor's sexual history, and often the victim was blamed for the offense. They were said to have lied or consented or prompted the encounter. Also in the past, up until around the mid-70s, it was not a crime to rape your wife because your wife was considered part of your property. We still to this day hear people talk about how some victim was asking for it. She was dressed provocatively, lacked experience, and quote-unquote wanted it. And furthermore, we also often needed corroborating evidence. So people wanted to show that there was physical resistance. Today we have rape shield laws, and this limits the amount of information about the personal or sexual history of victims that can be brought up in court. So things like your previous sexual partners, your type of clothing you were wearing. But a defense attorney can use language that hints at someone's character. They can refer to their child's father or previous partners, plural. They could talk about use of drugs or alcohol or their social status. And they'll often ask questions that they know will be overruled and that the judge will say can't be answered or, can't be asked. But once that question's already been heard by the jury, that idea's already been implanted in their mind. They might argue that it was a case of mistaken identity, that it was a sexual encounter short of intercourse, or that it was consensual. Many will ask repeated questions about the rape to try to unnerve the victim. They might emphasize that there was a delay in reporting, which is actually quite common. And they might also appeal to any gender biases. So rape crisis advocates began challenging the perceptions of rape while educating the community. And there's a lot of rape crisis centers in place. Again, we are mostly familiar with the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. They will provide victims with information about medical issues and provide a medical accompaniment. So BARC does provide this here in Massachusetts. BARC provides it in the greater Boston area where a medical advocate from BARC can be with you during the rape kit, during your hospital stay to kind of, inform you about your options and to provide some counseling or to connect you with counseling, both group and individual. And basically just kind of let you know what your rights are and to be there to help you answer questions and to advocate for you. And that wraps up this chapter on victims.